Hello, this is Claude Salhani, and this is This Week in Focus. Today we talk with Peter Roth in Washington, D.C. about a variety of things. We've had a very busy week. Amongst other things, the British Parliament convened yesterday to decide whether they would bomb the Islamic State in Syria. And the vote was overwhelmingly, yes, we will bomb the Islamic State in Syria. Peter, what do you make of that?
Well, frankly, I'm not surprised. I think David Cameron, the British Prime Minister, gave a very strong and persuasive speech on the floor of Commons, in which he explained what ought to be clear to everyone here in the West, that ISIS, ISIL, the Islamic State, whatever you want to call it, is at war with the United Kingdom, with France, with the United States, with Spain, with Germany, not because of what we do, but because of who we are. And that it is important that we stand resolute and together in our defense of Western civilization against people who want to take things back to a time when women were routinely subjugated, children were chattel, and no one was able to enjoy the kinds of living standards that we enjoy now.
So we bomb and bomb and bomb, and what next? Is there a plan? Should there be a plan to decide what to do once we finish bombing?
Well, there should be a plan. There isn't one, which concerns me. I think that the Obama administration has not really thought this through. What the commitment is. We also have the additional problem that Russian President Vladimir Putin seems to be saying to the world, "This is my fight. We're going to handle this," which has resulted in, as you've seen just the other day, clashes between the Russians and the Turks over accidents. I know that and I actually heard it from his own mouth, Prime Minister Netanyahu of Israel, talking of his trip to Moscow to meet with Putin to say, "This is what we're doing. Not sure what you're doing, but I'd really like it if our planes didn't crash into each other and we weren't shooting each other out of the sky." So it's a very tense, very difficult situation. And above all, you've got Barack Obama sitting around with no idea what to do.
Peter, you're in Washington, D.C. What is the thinking in the White House? What is President Obama thinking? I mean, there seems to be this void in leadership concerning this issue.
I don't. In all seriousness, I don't know that he is thinking. Barack Obama came into office promising to get us out of Iraq, to get us out of Afghanistan. He's largely done that. He promised that he would restore the world's respect for the United States and thinks he has done so. But he seems to regard the problem of global climate change, and has said so, as a greater problem than ISIS, the destabilization in Syria, the ongoing problems in Iraq. So I'm not sure that he actually is thinking about this. I'm not sure he realizes that this is America's problem.
I'm sure he is thinking, but what is he thinking? That's I think the question I ask myself, and I'd like to ask others. I mean, you're in D.C. You talk to people. You talk to people on the Hill. You talk to members of Congress. What is the general opinion? What has he reclused himself? Is he counting?
Well, the general opinion is that that we don't have a plan. That we need a plan, that the president needs to be given all of the tools necessary to fight ISIS without congressional interference. There is a discussion underway now about another authorization of the use of military force by some people. Congressman Tom Emmer of Minnesota has introduced a congressional declaration of war against ISIS. He says that ISIS is at war with us. We ought to recognize it. We ought to declare war against them. This is not without precedent. Jefferson and Congress declared war against the Barbary Pirates, I believe. It's not just against a nation state. And that all of it rests with the president, and he has the full authority to do what is necessary. I'm not sure that, though, even with that authority, that he would use it.
So we're back to the shores of Tripoli.
Well, If you want to look at it that way, yes. But the fact is that ISIS knows no geographic boundaries, has no government, but it is an army, and it is an army that threatens, I believe, U.S. interests and the interests of global civilization in a critical portion of the world.
Peter, what happened in Sacramento, in San Bernardino last night?
Still not clear. It's still not clear. I followed the news reports through the night, and then early this morning, they have, the last that I knew, they had two individuals that they believed to have been involved in this shooting that killed as many as 14 people, perhaps more, injured several dozen at a holiday party. Whether this was an act of terror, as it appears, since they showed up heavily armed and with body armor and masks, or it was a workplace violence incident, as others have suggested, I really don't know. I think it is.
It boggles my mind when they say we don't know if it's a terrorist act or not. It is a terrorist act. Does the perpetrator of the terrorist act have to be dark-skinned and Muslim to be terrorist, or?
No, I don't think that's the issue. I think the issue is that was this done for religious, ideological, political purposes, or was this done because some individual who worked in that rehabilitation center had a grudge against people who worked there and wanted to make a statement? I don't think we call that terrorism.
It's still a terrorist act.
Perhaps we should start calling that terrorism. It is clear, however, and has been for some time, that terrorism is here on U.S. shores, that there are individuals, groups of people who are engaging in mass shootings because they are affiliated with Al-Qaeda or ISIS or some other organization,
or Al-Shabaab in Minnesota.
Al-Shabaab, some group that is trying to destabilize the security here in the United States and to make people nervous, so that it will impact the way that the U.S. government helps other countries of the world prosecute their own problems, like ISIS in Iraq, in Syria now.
Where do you see this going?
Well, unfortunately, I think that this is just going to have to become something that the American people, while they don't necessarily get used to, come to expect may happen more frequently. I'm concerned about the potential for the abuse of police powers here in America. I'm concerned that there are some people who are calling for the closure of mosques and the rounding up of Islamic Americans sort of wholesale, so that we can sort them out. We certainly see this in the refusal of so many governors to accept Syrian refugees into their states. I mean, and you know, on the one hand, I understand why. You know, if in every 1,000 people you're letting in 2 people who are ISIS operatives or Al-Qaeda operatives or have allegiance to some other organization that are here not because they're seeking to live in peace and freedom, but because they want to get the plans to an electric plant and blow up the power grid, or they want to engage in a mass shooting in an indoor mall somewhere in the Midwest. I understand why that's a concern, and I feel it deeply. But I think that America has a higher obligation to be that shining city on a hill, that beacon of hope that says to everybody who's living under oppression around the world, there is a better way, and if you can get here, we'll take you in, and we will let you live in peace and harmony with your brotherhood of man and woman. That's what America's about.
Think about this for a second. Take Syria and what's happening in Syria today. So far, Syria has had a population of 18 million people before the civil war broke out. 9 million of those, half the population, have become refugees. Wouldn't it have made more sense to intervene before we got to that point?
I think it would have made more sense to intervene before we got to that point, but of course we had missteps with Obama's going in, going out, asking Congress, withdrawing his request from Congress. We had Putin pushing the United States out of the picture, and then of course there's the distasteful aspect of this, which would have been to back up Bashar al-Assad, who is not a nice man, and who is not a Democrat, small d, who does not believe in Republican, small r, form of government. He is a thug. He is a brutal dictator. He presides over a brutal regime, and to go in and back him up in the face of ISIS was not an attractive opportunity at the time. But again, it reminds us of what former UN Ambassador Jeane Kirkpatrick was writing about in the late 1970s, about the necessity of the United States to partner with authoritarian regimes around the world whose policies we may have disagreed with, but who were essential allies in fighting a greater enemy, Soviet communism. And I think time has shown that Ambassador Kirkpatrick was correct, and it may be time for a reevaluation of U.S. policy in that regard. Remember, we have no policy for dealing with terror groups right now. The Obama administration early on changed course from the direction of his predecessor and said there is no more war on terror. It's over. We're not going to use those words. They have discounted and underestimated the threat. Remember, it was President Obama who called ISIS a junior varsity organization, who has said on many occasions that they were contained. He even suggested after the Paris attacks that they were still contained, that they were not growing. And so he either underestimates the problem or is getting bad information from the U.S. intelligence community. Either way, we need a wholesale government-wide discussion here in the United States of how to deal with these problems and how to develop a long-term strategy that may be a 50 or 100-year strategy for dealing with this problem, just as we developed that for the Cold War.
That's impossible, seeing that where U.S. policies move in 4-year increments from presidential election to presidential election. I mean, 8 years if we're lucky. Otherwise, you get change of policies every 4 years. How can you plan 50 years when you're dealing in 4-year increments?
Well, it is true that the Defense Department worked under the late Paul Nitze, worked out a general framework for fighting communism, that the Soviet communism, that largely stayed in place from Truman through Reagan. There were derivations, but the essential policy, the essential goal was the same and was adopted by the military establishment here in the United States and the intelligence community, that this is what the basic thrust of the problem was going to be. And this is what we were going to do. And the same thing is possible to fight radical terrorism, the people who, in the name of Allah and Islam, have decided that it is important to destroy Israel and to wreak economic and physical havoc on the United States and other nations in the West that stand for the equality of man and women, and the proposition that people should be allowed to worship freely as they choose, that it's not the government's business one way or another.
Well, let's finish on some good news for a change. The Paris conference on the climate, that apparently everybody is now signed on that, yes, global warming is a real threat and it's not just a myth, including the United States. Is that a good thing or not?
Well, let's put it this way. There is abundant evidence that rich nation climate policy is bad for poor people in poor nations.
Well, it could be bad for rich nations too, because New York is one of the cities that's threatened to sink along with Colombo in Bangladesh.
New York is built on bedrock. It's not sinking. There's been no evidence. There's been no evidence that the ice caps are melting. There's been no evidence that the sea level is rising. What they're talking about doing may mitigate the increase in temperature by a half a degree Celsius or a degree Celsius, which really doesn't make very much difference. We still don't. There's a lot we don't understand about climate trends on this planet. We've only been tracking it for about 150 years. There have been the archaeological records tell us there have been temporary warming spells, and temporary ice ages.
The poles are melting. That's been proven scientifically.
The poles are not melting. There's more ice now than there was 10 years ago.
I'm not sure of that.
What we are saying here is that developing countries cannot have access to cheap, affordable sources of energy to build their economies, then we are going to continue to punish them for their lack of economic development up to this point. I think that's wrong. I think that everybody should have access to coal, natural gas, petroleum, in addition to wind and solar. And wind and solar are neither cheap nor free, and they have their own environmental ramifications. And of course, there are too many U.S. politicians. If you really want to produce energy that will carry the base load or produce the base load necessary here in the United States without carbon emissions, then you have to go to nuclear. France has proven that this can be done and can be done safely, but the naysayers here in the United States just don't believe it's possible.
You're praising the French finally. It's the first time I hear you do that. We're getting somewhere.
Yes.
Peter Roth, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Claude.
And I wish you a better tomorrow.
You as well.
Always interesting to talk with Peter Roth in Washington, D.C. We covered a lot of ground today and a very interesting discussion. And I leave you with wishes for a better tomorrow.